Hi, we are here today to talk about global marketing, channels, and physical distribution, and really channels and physical distribution in general. And then there are some nuances with global, but really it's a broad topic that applies to both domestic and international uh, ways of distribution. And this is the first thing that's important is to define channels of distribution. And these are all the intermediaries and organized networks of agencies that get products from the manufacturer to the end user of a good or a service. And they compare this to the physical distribution, which is just a physical movement of goods and services. And one of the things I want us to keep in mind when we talk about channels and physical distribution is some firms think of this as an afterthought, and they say, well, I'm going to focus on my product and making sure that I've got the right customer, and I'm going to worry about how to get it to them later. And this is probably a mistake in terms of you're either missing out on some efficiencies in your network that are cost you more money, or you're not reaching the right customers, or you're not able to do it yourself. And so think of this in terms of the firm's value proposition. Think of this in terms of their capabilities and what they're good at and what they're not good at. One of the things that really drives me nuts when you hear advertisements on, it used to be automobile networks, where they said, we're cutting out the middleman. We're coming straight to you to save you money. Well, sometimes cutting out the middleman actually costs more money, because the middleman, or the middle person, the intermediary, can sometimes perform functions for cheaper or better or more efficient than you can do yourself. That's why we outsource certain things for businesses, because we think they can do them better than we can ourselves, because that's not the area we are in business. So let's jump to the second part, where we look at compare and contrast different ways that companies utilize distribution networks. And there's never a right or wrong formula, right? There's not a formula that says, well, if you're this big, you need to use this type of channel, because companies use this in different ways. And Coca-Cola and Pepsi are great examples of how they utilize channels for their strategic value proposition. And I'd like to compare this to a competitor. I guess you'd call them a competitor, a niche competitor, a small competitor called Shasta Cola. And probably about half the class, if you're dispersed around the country, have heard of Shasta. Shasta is considered a low-cost alternative. It's only in certain markets. And the two different ways they're distributed strategically is Coke and Pepsi. As a firm, let's say Coke as a firm, really the only thing that Coke sells itself out of their manufacturing plant in Georgia is syrup, these big jugs of syrup, and they send them to their local bottlers or their independent bottlers. Some are company-owned bottlers, but typically they're independent bottlers. And those bottlers will actually create the product and put it in the cans and send it out to the restaurants, put it in bottles, manage the vending machines, etc. Because Coca-Cola says, we're not good at that. We don't have the feet on the ground to have that reach that we need to have. Now compare that to Shasta Cola. Shasta Cola uses their economies of scale. They have two main manufacturing plants. There was talk recently that they were adding a third, so they may have added a third manufacturing plant in Salt Lake City, but the two manufacturing plants are on the coast. And so that may be why certain people have heard of it, because they're closer to the manufacturing plants. They use their economies of scale. They produce millions and millions of cans of soda or pop per day, and it's much cheaper for them to produce the actual product than it is Coca-Cola. So why wouldn't Coca-Cola do that? Well, Coca-Cola has made it a strategic initiative to say that we want to have Coca-Cola within the reach of every consumer in the world. So to them, it's a convenience product, and they want to have it available to people. And they said, from a centralized distribution, it's very tough for us to connect to all of those people all around the world from a centralized fashion. So if we decentralize our distribution, we have local people connecting to them. Where Shasta said, we can't compete with that. We're not big enough, so we just have to sell it a lot cheaper, have our costs a lot lower, and we'll have to make up regional agreements. But they certainly don't have the reach. They may be, even in places where Shasta is available, they may be in some grocery stores, but they don't make it to restaurants or food service applications, etc. And so that's one area of channels that's used very differently amongst similar companies. Another example is music. And music has changed dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think we're all familiar with music now that it's streaming music. Physical CDs are virtually non existent in sales anymore. And so the distribution is now a direct distribution for a firm like Spotify, which streams your music, and there's other companies out there that do it as well. Compare this to 10 years ago, possibly, where most people bought them through CDs. And before that, it was through vinyl records, and there was a network of stores and retailers that would sell them, etc. And so that channel distribution has changed quite significantly. The third example I use here is used textbooks. And used textbooks are really interesting because because you've all bought textbooks in some form or another, and you go to Amazon and you see a third-party seller of a textbook. That generally comes from a third party. It's not affiliated with Amazon other than a contractual relationship. And so one time when I was in grad school, I actually called the gal that was selling me a book and asked her about what she did, because I was studying this and I was interested, and I, as a marketer, become interested, ask people about these things. And it was interesting because she, as a single mom, she was in school herself. She would go to garage sales once a week, once a month. And she said that they would have books out sometimes, and she would say, well, do you have any more books? And they would go, yeah, absolutely. And she'd explain what she was doing. And she goes, people would pretty much give me all their books. And I have a whole garage full of books that I resell because she can get them very inexpensive. But for the textbook market, one of the reasons why there's so many editions of textbooks is because they want to update it, and there's a legitimate need to update information. But the second reason is because once the first run of a textbook is done, or a new edition, then everything becomes the used textbook market because they're recycled through the textbook market. And so the publisher only makes money off their basically the first run is where they get 90% of their sales. And so they really have to rely on that, because then it goes into the secondary market with used sellers, typically on Amazon, buying used textbooks or amongst your friends, etc. And it will be interesting to see where this goes via music, whether it will become an online channel or where the physical distribution of textbooks are. And that's an evolving industry, but certainly the channels of distribution, how students get information, is evolving and can be part of a strategic value proposition for a firm. So those are a few introductions and some examples. I'd like to move on and talk about this concept of channel utility. Channel utility is there because that's why marketing channels exist, to create utility. And there are 4 types of utility that we can talk about that are part of that are channel utility: place, time, form, and information. Now, the place utility is the availability of a product or service in a location that's convenient for the potential customer. Coca-Cola realized this early on, is it's a convenience product. People don't go out in the morning generally and say, I'm going to get a Coca-Cola at 2:00 this afternoon and I'm going to plan my day around it. No, you're doing something and you're saying, gosh, I'm thirsty. You happen to see a Coke machine or Pepsi machine and you'll go buy it. So you don't put a lot of thought into it. And so Coca-Cola had said that we need to make it within an arm's reach length of every potential customer in the world. And I want you to think about being on Creighton's campus and think about the concept of taking a tennis ball and tying it to a string. And that string can be 100 yards long, maybe 50 yards long, 50 feet, depending. And think of the buildings being non-existent. But you could virtually walk across anywhere on campus and swing that tennis ball, and you would probably hit some form of Pepsi on campus, because Pepsi is the preferred vendor on Creighton's campus. You'd hit a machine, you'd hit a dining area that sells Pepsi. And that's the idea, is that anywhere you are on campus, you should be within 50 to 100 yards of some type of Pepsi product. And that's because they place a firm emphasis on place utility. Time utility is making the product available at the time people need that. So you could think of a restaurant, time of day, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. One of the things that I think about a lot is you look at a place like Lowe's or Home Depot, and it's when the transitions of the seasons happen from summer to winter, from winter to summer, and we can put fall or spring in between there. But they transition from bringing out, they bring out lawnmowers and put the snowblowers away. Okay, and then when it's fall and it's going into winter, they put the lawnmowers away and they bring the snowblowers out. And you'll notice when you go in those stores, look on top of all their rafters, and generally on the very top, whatever's in the off season, you see stored up there. You see lawnmowers stored during the winter and snowblowers stored in the summer. And they do that because part of the utility is a time utility. They make them available when people need them certain times of the year. So they perform other functions, but certainly that would be an example of time utility. The third one is form utility, and that's getting a product or service prepared or in the proper condition for use by the customer. And use this example: you're really hungry and you're telling your friend how hungry you are, and they hand you a live chicken. Now that doesn't do you a lot of good if you're really hungry. But pulling into a Chick-fil-A and have a finished chicken sandwich does you a lot of good when you're hungry, because one of the things that Chick-fil-A does is they perform the form utility function within the part of their strategy is to have this in the right form people want. And so it's in the form of a chicken sandwich. So it's processed all the way down. And there are intermediaries. So there's the chicken processor, and then there's a chicken intermediary that distributes them and maybe cuts up the chickens into smaller pieces and ready to go. And then that sends to the main distribution center for Chick-fil-A, and then they send them out to the restaurants, probably already processed. All they have to do is be cooked. And so that would be a form utility. And think about the different products and different forms. Maybe from a computer, you can buy all the components to build a computer, and then a computer store that sells those components would be providing that utility. Or you could buy the finished product at a Best Buy or an Apple store, and that would be the utility that's in a ready-to-use form as well. Finally, and this is in a sense the top of the food chain. As a company matures, they get more into the information utility, and that's the availability to answer questions in general communication about the products. And Apple has a really interesting past about this, because there's a whole chapter in the Steve Jobs biography that in that biography, it's almost 1,000 pages, and each chapter is like a book in of itself. But Steve Jobs was obsessed with creating this Apple Store. And everybody said, Jobs, you're crazy. Why are you doing this? It's so expensive to get people products from these Apple stores. You're never going to be able to reach your customer. And he replied that, I'm not trying to sell them the product, but if I'm going to charge 2 to 3 times as much as the comparable product of Windows computer or a phone, consumers need to see the ecosystem and how this works. They need to play with it. They need to touch it. They need to see how it goes across devices and how iCloud works, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to make a store that they can go in and talk to experts. Now, they don't make money necessarily off of selling the products there. It's cheaper for them to sell it through Best Buy or sell it online. But people come into the store to feel comfortable. Maybe they just buy it because they know there's a store close by, and they know that if they need help, they can get help. And so that's the value of an Apple Store, is the information utility. So I want you as a consumer to think about different companies and different products and think about what type of utility. And I don't want you to say, well, okay, Chick-fil-A provides, here's how they provide place, time, form, and information utility. I want you to think of what is the main strategic utility they provide, and they get it to you. And think of different examples for different products. So that is channel objectives, and that's the utility that marketing channels bring. Now, the third thing that I'd like to talk about today, and the final thing, are consumer channels versus business channels or industrial channels. If you remember the definition of consumer versus industrial products, consumers buy products to consume. B2B or industrial products are bought as an input to another product. If you look at the slide on consumer product channels, there's a lot going on there. At the very top, there's the M, which is the manufacturer. The bar across the bottom is called customers. And then there's all sorts of ways in between to get to those end users. Customers tend to buy products maybe once or twice in their lifetime, or very infrequently. They don't have a regular way of doing it, and they have to start, and they buy in smaller quantities. So they use from the manufacturers. They can either go direct, You can order things directly through a manufacturer. Maybe they have door-to-door sales reps. A lot of the parts of the world use door-to-door sales reps, and even in places like Japan, car dealerships come directly to the house. They bring them to the door on a big truck, and they bring the different types of cars, and that's how it's done there. You can use a manufacturer's sales force as an intermediary. You can use a retailer. The manufacturer's sales force calls on a retailer to get it to the consumer. So usually a retailer is involved in that process. You can have a series of wholesalers, and they tend to break bulk, so they buy large quantities and sell it to smaller quantities to get it to the resellers. You can have agents or brokers, etc. So there's a lot of people involved in getting it from the manufacturer to the end user. Now, this is where intermediaries can actually make things cheaper, because if you're maybe chewing gum, you can't afford to have a sales force just bringing your chewing gum to all the convenience stores and grocery stores, etc. You bundle that with another manufacturer that's bringing other products in, and you may have a manufacturer sales rep that covers a variety of different products that are unrelated to each other. Their only relationship is maybe for a place like Ace Hardware. A friend of mine out of college worked for a distributor where he repped Igloo coolers, and he repped some certain tools and other items, and he'd go into like an Ace Hardware and say, I can represent these different products to you and get them to you. And so he was paid by a number of different distributors because they couldn't afford their own distribution channel because they weren't big enough. And so in that sense, they made things less expensive. So that's a consumer channel. Very dense. There are lots of different steps to the consumer channel, and especially if you compare that now to look at the industrial products, and you'll see the industrial products, there are really very few ways to get them to the customer. Okay, there's the manufacturer to the customer, which is probably about 70-80% of all industrial goods. You might have a manufacturer sales force, you might have a wholesaler in between to get to the customers, but I tell you, the biggest difference why it's a simpler process is because customers in industrial products, it's an input to their product. So they tend to be specialized. They buy in very large quantities, and they buy it very frequently. And so they know it well. So there's not the need for these multiple channels to help manage that process. They can buy it directly from the manufacturer or through one intermediary. So again, industrial goods are inputs to their own product. Just like at Creighton University, you would say a photocopier would be an input to your overall education, or things like desks in the classroom or classroom projectors. They're not used for consumption. They're used as an input to the other products. So we have a whole staff of people that all they do is they buy furniture. We have a staff of people at Creighton that all they do is they buy furniture for classrooms or for offices. And so they know that furniture well. And that's what they do day in and day out. We have technology people that all they do is they buy projectors. They buy classroom projection equipment. They know this stuff inside and out. So when they call on, they can usually buy directly from the manufacturer or internet equipment throughout the facility as well. So again, comparing consumer versus industrial channels, industrial channels tend to be much narrower, much less dense, and much flatter than a consumer channel because of the buying in bulk and the specialization of consumer channels, of industrial channels. So that's all I'd like to cover today. There's more in the chapter and more on the slides, but I'd just like to cover those main points on channels of distribution. Thank you.